Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most haunting chapters of the ongoing war in Ukraine, a story that has come to symbolize both failed promises and the brutal reality of modern conflict. This story, often referred to as Putin's corridor turns to ashes, it's a phrase that captures the tragic transformation of what was supposed to be a route to safety into a corridor of destruction, a lifeline that collapsed under the weight of bombs, lies, and despair. When the war began, the idea of humanitarian corridors seemed like a glimmer of hope. Civilians trapped in cities like Mariupol, Kherson, and Melitopol could escape through designated routes. These corridors were meant to protect the innocent, to give them a chance to flee the chaos and reach safety. Yet, as the world would come to witness, those corridors quickly became traps, zones of uncertainty where shells still fell, and promises of ceasefire shattered within hours. The name Putin's corridor referred not only to humanitarian escape routes, but also to a broader strategic goal. It symbolized the land bridge that Vladimir Putin's forces sought to create between the Donbas region and the Crimean Peninsula. This corridor was meant to secure Russian control of the southern Ukrainian coast along the Sea of Azov, giving Russia a continuous path from its own territory to the annexed Crimean region. But as with so many military ambitions, what looked like a victory on a map became a humanitarian nightmare on the ground. In the city of Mariupol, the world saw this horror unfold in real time. Once a bustling port city, Mariupol was reduced to rubble by months of relentless bombardment. Apartment blocks, hospitals, and theaters turned to ashes. Thousands of civilians trapped inside found themselves without electricity, without food, without hope. Local officials called the city a dead land, a place where every promise of escape turned to dust. When the first humanitarian corridors were announced, families rushed to gather their few belongings. They believed the announcements broadcast by both Russian and Ukrainian officials. They hoped the fighting would stop long enough to let them leave. But reports quickly surfaced that the supposed safe routes were being shelled, that convoys were being stopped, searched, or redirected into Russian-controlled areas. Some buses vanished for days, some never made it out. People who did manage to flee described scenes that sounded like something from another century. Entire neighborhoods in flames, streets filled with debris, the constant thunder of explosions in the distance. Many said they left behind loved ones who couldn't move, the elderly, the sick, the wounded. Others spoke of friends who tried to reach the corridors but never returned. For the Russian government, the so-called corridor had dual meanings. On one side, it was a military prize, the land corridor connecting Crimea with occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. On the other, it became a tool of propaganda. Moscow announced humanitarian efforts even as bombs continued to fall, portraying itself as offering mercy while enforcing siege warfare. For the people on the ground, those contradictions meant life or death. The Ukrainian government and local authorities called the situation what it was: a betrayal of international law, a violation of basic human decency. Evacuation efforts, coordinated with international organizations like the Red Cross, often failed because shelling never truly stopped. Ceasefire agreements lasted only minutes. Entire convoys were trapped between lines of fire, with civilians caught in the middle. The destruction of Mariupol became the most powerful symbol of this failed corridor. Satellite images showed entire districts wiped out. Drone footage revealed a wasteland of gray ruins. At one point, international observers compared it to Aleppo during the Syrian war, another city where promises of safe passage were broken again and again. The world watched horrified, yet powerless, To understand why this corridor turned to ashes, we have to look beyond the battlefield and into the mindset driving it. For the Russian military, control of land outweighed concern for civilians. The creation of a geographic corridor meant dominance, a means of controlling trade, territory, and narrative. But for the people living there, it was a corridor to nowhere, a path that began in hope and ended in ruin. The phrase turns to ashes isn't just poetic, it's literal. When journalists finally reached parts of Mariupol, they described streets covered in gray dust, with the smell of burned materials lingering in the air. Buildings were hollowed out, cars melted into blackened shapes. Survivors said it felt as though the city itself had been erased. The corridors that were meant to guide people out had instead guided the world's attention in, exposing the tragedy for all to see. International reaction was swift but cautious. Governments condemned the attacks, called for accountability, and demanded that humanitarian corridors be respected. Yet, despite the statements, the situation on the ground did not improve. Russian forces tightened their control, and evacuation became nearly impossible. Thousands of people were reportedly deported to Russian territories, raising further questions about the true purpose of those so-called humanitarian efforts. In every war, there are moments that define its moral core. For Ukraine, Mariupol and its broken corridor became that moment. It showed the limits of diplomacy when one side uses negotiation as a weapon. It demonstrated how fragile hope can be when trust is destroyed. And it reminded the world that civilian protection is not a luxury. It's a fundamental right that can disappear overnight. As weeks turned into months, Mariupol became a ghost city. The once promised corridors were no longer discussed. They simply ceased to exist. What remained was silence, broken only by the sound of distant explosions. Survivors who escaped carried the trauma with them, not just of war, but of betrayal. They spoke of promises that were never kept, of loved ones left behind, of the haunting image of a city that died waiting for mercy. The story of Putin's corridor turning to ashes is more than a military analysis. It's a lesson in how easily words can lose their meaning in war. Humanitarian, safe, corridor, these terms once symbolized compassion and protection. In Mariupol, they became hollow phrases, reminders of what could have been. The failure of that corridor has also reshaped how humanitarian organizations operate in war zones. Many now insist on international supervision, neutral observers, and direct satellite monitoring before agreeing to coordinate evacuations. The experience showed that without enforcement, even written agreements can be manipulated. The tragedy in Mariupol changed the vocabulary of modern warfare. It turned humanitarian corridors from hopeful measures into cautionary tales. Even today, when you look at maps of southern Ukraine, you can trace the line that was supposed to be the corridor. It stretches from Donetsk to Crimea, passing through Mariupol's ruins. To strategists, it may look like a route of control, but to the survivors, it's a scar, a reminder of what they lost. It's the route their families once tried to take to safety, only to find themselves trapped. And yet, in all this darkness, there are moments of courage that should not be forgotten. Volunteers who risked their lives to drive buses into dangerous zones. Doctors who stayed behind to treat the wounded. Journalists who documented the truth when lies were easier to spread. Their stories keep the memory of those corridors alive, not as symbols of failure, but as proof of human endurance. When the phrase turns to ashes is spoken, it also reflects what happens to the dreams of ordinary people in war. The dream of returning home, of seeing family again, of rebuilding a life, all burned away by violence. The corridor that was supposed to lead them to safety led instead to devastation. But still, people survived. They carried their memories, their pain, and their hope into the future. The world continues to debate who is responsible and what justice might look like. War crimes investigations have gathered testimony and evidence. Human rights groups continue to document forced deportations, civilian casualties, and attacks on non-military targets. Each report adds another layer to the history of that broken corridor, ensuring it will not be forgotten. In the grander scheme of this conflict, the ashes of Putin's corridor are a symbol of failed ambition, the belief that domination can erase resistance, that brutality can erase truth. Yet every survivor's story contradicts that belief. They remind the world that even in ruin, humanity persists. Today, Mariupol stands as both a wound and a warning. Its streets, once filled with life, are now silent monuments to what happens when power tramples compassion. The corridor that promised salvation has become a symbol of betrayal, and yet the memory of those who walked it, who tried to escape, who dared to hope, that memory endures. So when we talk about Putin's corridor turns to ashes, we're not just describing a failed military plan or a broken humanitarian promise. We're talking about the collapse of morality in the face of power. We're talking about how, in modern warfare, even the word safe can become dangerous. As the world watches new fronts open and new cities fall under attack, the lessons of Mariupol must not fade. Every future corridor, every negotiation for civilian safety, must remember this story, that promises without protection mean nothing, and that even the smallest betrayal can cost thousands of lives. Thank you for watching. If this explanation helped you understand the tragic meaning behind Putin's corridor and the reality of what unfolded, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into world events. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think humanitarian corridors can ever truly work in war? Stay informed, stay compassionate, and as always, take care of one another.